Finally, we're going to discuss contemporary China. And by now, I'm sure you know that I love contemporary art. It's my focus, right, as far as my own research. And one of the reasons I really love talking about Chinese contemporary art is because I think it's such a break from what they did in the past. Um, and it's an interesting way of looking at where their future is going to. And when I look at a lot of the contemporary artists, I see this interesting mix of the communistic principles that Mao brought to them, but also I see this embrace of capitalism and a lot of Western values as well. So they're an interesting mix of these two worldviews when you look at their contemporary art. I also think it's interesting to look at contemporary artists in China because there's still a lot of censorship that their government does on a daily basis, and a lot of things that we probably take for granted, like Twitter, are outlawed there. You know, they're not allowed to use these platforms in the same way that we do. And so when you look at their contemporary artists, they're often struggling against this idea of like, what are their freedoms? What are they able to make? And then will they be punished for making certain types of pieces? So there feels like this sort of, there's a little bit of fraught tension when you look at a lot of their contemporary artists. And so that's another reason I find their contemporary artists really compelling and very important, I think, on the world stage. Now, what are some of the themes that we can think about looking at contemporary Chinese art? I think one of the first things you have to note, of course, is that a lot of these artists are moving away from the idea of Mao and moving beyond that. They're rejecting him quite strongly in a lot of the work. Now, this is a work by Western artist Andy Warhol, but I love the comical way that Warhol shows Mao, almost like he's wearing makeup, right? And I think, you know, even though Warhol was a Western pop artist, you know, working in the 60s, I think that we can think about this idea of how do you invert Mao's imagery? How do you take it from that seriousness of social realism, and then how do you reject it? And again, I think a lot of these contemporary Chinese artists are rejecting Mao's platform and they're trying to build something new. So when I look at their art, I really see kind of two different categories. I see what I describe as the new traditionalists, people who are trying to honor tradition but in a new way. And then I also see what I call the emerging capitalists. I see people who are using the imagery of capitalism, Western goods, as a platform, as something that they're saying, why can't we have more of this, maybe perhaps. So those are the two groups I really note when I look at the contemporary artists here. I'll start us out by looking at the new traditionalists because I think that's a logical place to begin. And we're going to look first at the artist Ai Weiwei, one of my favorite artists working today. One of the reasons I love him so much is because he really thinks about how do you use propaganda, how do you use social media platforms, how do you use every opportunity to get your message across, right? How do you do that? He's very savvy about communication. And when he starts out, you can tell he really is very interested in the idea of tradition in Chinese art. Things like Ming vases, for instance, which he uses replicas, you know, he makes replicas of them in these pieces. How do you look at the past, the symbols of the past, and honor them while making new and interesting art pieces? So a lot of his early work is about like how do you take something like a Ming vase and make it visually striking and interesting and new. His whole mentality is you don't have to completely get rid of the past in order to move into the future. And this is often at odds with what you see happening in China today. A lot of what China does is simply destroy the past in order to move into the future. And there's kind of two different camps of thought on this right now in China. And Ai Weiwei is saying, in his opinion, you need to understand tradition, you need to understand your history, your past, or, you know, they often say you're doomed to repeat it. So he wants to find ways that he can bring older forms of art or older ideas of art right into his pieces and honor it. Um, you know, something like this piece where it's this sort of old school terracotta vase, but you get imprinted with the Coca-Cola logo. You know, he's saying that, yeah, we're going to have a much more consumerist mentality, but why can't we also hold on to the past as well? And then he sort of moved into doing more installation style works. Installations, of course, being more room size pieces that are about the experience of the piece, right? So he starts thinking about how do I make larger scale works. And so tea house, he makes this little compressed house made out of used tea. And once again, it's sort of a nod to Chinese heritage because tea drinking in Chinese culture and most Asian culture is something they do on a daily basis. It's a very common daily activity, and it also holds ritualistic significance in a lot of ways when you look at Buddhism and meditation and such. So he finds these emblems of Chineseness, I say, and he finds ways to sort of reinvent them or rethink them. Um, he also, in a sense, says, why do you have to scrap the past? This map of China that he made, first off, which many found controversial because of areas of China that he included, such as disputed territories such as Tibet, Macau, etc. He actually made this piece out of wood that was reclaimed from old temples. So why, reclaim this wood? If you know anything about the Three Gorges Dam project in China, which was begun, I believe, in the end of the late 80s into the 90s, and basically it was going to be this massive hydroelectrical dam that was going to provide electricity to a much larger segment of the Chinese population. And but unfortunately, when they were going to build the Three Gorges Dam, it was going to create a flood, basically, and a man-made lake that was going to cover over a significant portion of the Chinese landscape in a certain region, drowning a lot of these old traditional villages. So this is when I talk about, again, what is this sort of push and pull between heritage and progress? The Chinese seem to be really locked in this struggle right now in their contemporary dealings, where they, like, how do you honor the past, but how do you progress? So to build this dam, they were going to have to destroy all these old villages. So what Ai Weiwei did is he went into these areas and he started to reclaim the wood from a lot of these old traditional Buddhist temples and Taoist temples and such. And he started to make artworks with them. So this piece, it's a map of China, but to me, it's using an old piece of Chinese history to create the work. So it's honoring the past, while showing you a map of their future, we might say. So again, I think he has these very interesting ways of approaching how he makes his artworks, how he constructs them. This is his work, Forever Bicycles, and in these pieces with the bicycles, he's done different variations on the theme. You'll notice. I love this one. I just feel like it's so overwhelming and almost stereoscopic, and it sort of dazzles me when I look at it. It makes me feel sort of like woo. So this is one of my favorite versions of Forever Bicycles. But like, why make something like this? He talks about how in the past bicycles used to be the primary mode of transportation for most Chinese people. When I was living in China in '97, you couldn't go out to a city street without seeing hundreds and hundreds of bicycles streaming past you. And there were very few cars. There was like a lot of bus transportation and the bicycles, but very few cars. If you go to China today, most people have traded in their bike for a car to the point where the Chinese are actually struggling with gridlock because too many people now have cars for the infrastructure that exists. They're very famous for their traffic jams. There was a traffic jam probably about like 6, 7 years ago. Like it went on for like a month. People were just their cars were just trapped in traffic. Like that sounds like that could never happen, but it did. So he's in a sense he's making these pieces. You'll note that always kind of illustrate the old way of something and then like a problem of moving into the future. So he's like, okay, this is our past. Is what we've traded our past for worth it? Might we say? Is it worth the traffic jams and the gridlock, where we used to all efficiently get around on bikes? So to me, there's always this undercurrent of like how the past and the present and the future are coexisting for him. There are these interesting social commentaries. World Map is one of my favorite social commentaries that he did, and it speaks to a method that he uses for a lot of his work, where he looks at sort of how he can work communally with other artists. He has the idea, might we say, but how can he have it executed by a lot of different people who work in a certain trade, let's say. This is what we call conceptual art, by the way, where the artist has an idea, a concept, might we say, and then he finds other artists to help him execute it. So we often say his hand isn't directly tied to the piece, it's more about his mind being tied directly to the piece. So it's an interesting way of considering how to make artwork that's not really about intrinsic skill or, again, fine art talent in that way. So in World Map, he wanted to make a piece where he was commenting on the textile industry or the cloth industry, the fashion industry. The fact that most clothing now is made very cheaply in parts of the world that don't have a lot of labor laws or labor protections. And China is one of those places, by the way. So, I always tell my students, if you want to do an interesting activity, take your shirt off, look at the tag, and look to see where your shirt was actually made. I'm pretty sure it's probably made somewhere like Guatemala, China, Thailand, etc., and so forth. Places that don't have a lot of labor laws. And so you can have cheap, 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 cheap labor. So he's trying to bring to our minds the problem with this kind of labor, that it's, crippling. It's an economy that creates cheap, fast fashion, but at what cost? I think about 5 years ago, there were a lot of stories in the press about people in the iPhone factories in China where they were throwing themselves off the buildings because they made so little money. They felt they had no way to escape this, mentality of cheap labor. So they were literally committing suicide by throwing themselves off the top of the factories. Now, the solution was that the factories put up nets around the rooftops. Notice they didn't pay the people more. They just wanted to keep them from killing themselves. And Ai Weiwei is trying to call our attention to this. Like, what is your cheap fashion worth? What is your new iPhone worth? When you think about the cost of the human labor. So again, notice there's always this social commentary in the things that he's doing. So what he did for this piece is he hired textile workers and he paid them a living wage to make this project. It was his comment on we could do better by people economically. We could do better by them, but we choose not to. We choose the cheap way out. So again, on the surface, it just looks like a map, but when you understand the materials, the labor, and the way that he used the labor, it becomes much, much, much more interesting. Which leads us to Sunflower Seeds, probably one of his most famous works that he did for the Tate Modern in the years 2010 and 2011. The Tate Modern is in London, and it is a museum that was created in a defunct power plant. And in this room, there used to be a giant turbine that sucked water out of the Thames River and brought it into the structure and moved the turbine hydroelectrically, right, to make power. Today it's just this big open space. So what the Tate does with it now is they have installation works in the space. So Sunflower Seeds was a piece made up of thousands and thousands and thousands of porcelain sunflower seeds that were all handcrafted by ceramic makers that Ai Weiwei hired. So just like the textile piece, the world map, what he does is he finds people who work in ceramics, which is a very traditional Chinese craft, fine arts craft, and honors their labor in a sense. He also paid them a living wage, just like he did with the textile workers, to create these individualized, handcrafted, hand-painted ceramic sunflower seeds that were then spread out in the space and people interacted with them. Again, it's an interesting way of commenting on labor and value of labor, and then the idea that he is the driver of the thought behind that labor, but he employs others to help him make that vision come true. If you watch the videos on the sunflower seeds, it's very interesting to watch how interactive the piece is. And again, these are all porcelain pieces that can crack or break, but this idea that it doesn't matter, there's so many of them, it's like an ocean of sunflower seeds. And there's something I always think is very freeing about watching an interactive piece like that, where people are you just have fun because you're like, I'm allowed to walk on this and lay in it and play with it. Like, it's just a lot of fun. And if you watch the press release of the piece, it's fun to watch him where he's being photographed, right, by people, and then he's photographing them back. And then he'll break off and he'll go on Twitter and you can see he's posting things. So he is always thinking about how to use all these platforms of social media. And the reason why is because of his own heritage, his own background. And so I'm showing you some of his earlier works, which I call his protest works. His background is that his family were Maoist dissenters, to the point where his father was actually sent to a labor camp under Mao. And so he grew up in a family where he understood very much what it was to dissent against Mao, to dissent against communism, and how you could personally suffer for that. And so he said part of what he does with his work is he wants to challenge the statism of China, right? That control that the Chinese seem to want to have over everything everybody does. Um, and that to use his works in a sense to protest the things he thinks that they're doing that are not right. And he talks about how this does not mean he does not have fear, and I completely agree with this. This idea that you do brave things, people just think you're fearless. And it's like, to be brave doesn't mean you don't have fear, you know. And he talks about how it makes his family fearful too, where his mother will often say to him, "Do you have to do such political works? I worry." And he's like, "I have to be brave. I have to stand up for what I believe in." But he talks about every time he leaves the country, like when he went to the Tate Modern to do the sunflower seed piece in London, he's always wondering whether he'll be allowed to go back into China because he's sort of an enemy of the state. There's a whole crew of people that follows him around in China and documents what he's doing at all times because he's such a dissident. He actually did a piece where he realized that he was being taped all the time by these government agents. So he hired a crew of people to tape the government agents taping him. And it was this brilliant commentary on surveillance, like who's watching who. And is it more impactful to have someone, to not know someone's watching you, right? Or, so how does that all work? So I would say his pieces, a lot of them are about protests, but he talks about how he fears, what he's doing all at the same time. So he's a very brave man. The snake ceiling, for instance, the piece you're seeing here, it was actually made with children's backpacks aligned to look like a snake on the ceiling. And this piece was actually inspired by the earthquake that happened in South China, probably about 5, 6 years ago now, that ended up killing a lot of people and a lot of school children. Because what had happened was the Chinese government had built these school buildings with very shoddy materials and shoddy labor. So when the earthquake hit, the buildings just collapsed and killed all the children inside. But of course, they wanted to cover that up. So Ai Weiwei went into the district, it was the Guizhou district, and he started trying to ask questions about, like, well, who died? How many people died? What were their names? And all the government authorities were like, no, I can't answer these questions. Please go away. Please stop asking me these things. All these low-level dignitaries were like, no, I will get killed if I answer your questions. Like, no, I'll get disappeared. I can't answer these things. So he said that he wanted to make a monument to the dead, but he couldn't find out their names, couldn't find out their background. So he decided instead to use the symbol of the children's backpack as a way of almost making a grave marker. It's really interesting stuff. I think these pieces speak for themselves. He's obviously very anti-authority and anti-government in a lot of ways. Um, this piece that he did in front of the Forbidden City. And, he was right to worry. A couple years ago, he actually was taken by the government and he was disappeared for a couple months. So around the world, the arts community started making these stencils that you're looking at here, where they put them on buildings and walls, and it just said, "Where is Ai Weiwei?" And it was kind of this grassroots online movement, and kind of graffiti art movement in a sense. But when he was actually released from jail, he basically was very clear about, like, yeah, I was beaten up, I was tortured. So again, being brave doesn't mean you don't have fear, and it doesn't mean that you won't maybe suffer consequences. There's a great documentary on Ai Weiwei. I always recommend it to people, so definitely watch it. It used to be streaming on Netflix. I think now you have to get it on disc, but There's also the Leon County system has Canopy. You might be able to find it there. It's free through the Leon County Library. But I always recommend watching the documentary on Ai Weiwei. It's called Never Sorry. Uh, the other artist I always show you about new tradition is Kwai Gongqiang and his works using fireworks to create paintings in a sense. Firework paintings, I guess we could call these. What he does is he lays down fuses onto paper and then lights them, and it makes these different patterns. It's an interesting combination of like a commentary on traditional Chinese painting and the look of that, ink on paper, but it also is a commentary on the use of fireworks in a lot of Chinese ceremonies. Like for their New Year's celebrations and such, fireworks are a common way to celebrate. So he makes these gigantic pieces that look like ink on paper at first, but then when you understand more about them, you realize they're made with fireworks. He also makes very large scale installation works as well. And again, when you watch the videos of him working, it's just really impactful to see how he uses the fireworks to create these monumental large scale pieces. He also does performance pieces and installation works, of course, where it's like a one time event kind of piece. And this is the one he did at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, Exploding Flower. And again, I just love this idea of like how to update tradition and make it something new and something interesting.